Welcome again, everybody. Tom Trowbridge, and I'm here with Kyle Samani. Very thrilled to have Kyle. For those of you who may want a little bit of an introduction to Kyle, he is the founder and managing partner of Multicoin Capital. And if you don't know Multicoin Capital, as I've said before, you're probably in the wrong room. Multicoin is a multi-billion-dollar venture firm that has been is focused exclusively on kind of the crypto and blockchain space, and has been doing this for many years, both on the venture side and also on the liquid side. So I've known Kyle for many years and was thrilled that he and Multicoin led the Series A for Fluence, and is thrilled to have him here to talk about DePIN because he's been investing in DePIN before it was DePIN. So with that, Kyle, can you maybe start off with talking about some of the early investments you made in companies that kind of weren't DePIN at the time, but have later since become DePIN, and how you think about that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Oh, yeah, it's working. Hi, my name is Kyle. I'm a co-founder at Multicoin Capital. We were very fortunate to kind of help, I think, create the DePIN space, at least in some extent. And kind of, I think, our first and most notable investment on that front was probably Helium. Amir, who's the founder of Helium, founded it in 2013. And his vision from day one was to build a global IoT network, smart thermostats, smart mouse traps, smart water sensors if like water's leaking, agriculture, smart parking sensors, so if you park, your car can automatically pay, whatever. He wanted a smart IoT world. And he wanted to have IoT radio waves everywhere so that all of these smart devices could work. So that was the vision in 2013. And at the time, the radio technologies just were getting to the point that they thought they could build the base stations or the hotspots at low enough price point and enough scale to eventually do that. So they raised a few rounds of funding from Google Ventures, Kozla Ventures, FirstMark, a few others, and started scaling up enterprise deployments. They had a few thousand deployments in like factories and schools and universities and all kinds of stuff. And their customers by 2016, early 2017, were coming to them saying, "Hey, this is great. Can you cover the whole city of New Orleans?" And they were like, "We don't know how to cover the whole city of New Orleans." And Amir in mid 2017 was ICO, middle of the ICO bubble, and he was like, ICOs are wild and crypto is cool. He'd always had an early Bitcoiner guy, and he's like, "Dude, what if we could get random people to set up hotspots and earn some tokens?" And so they really had the genesis of the idea. Amir started reading some of our early blog posts and when Multicoin was very young, and we got kind of connected with him over the course of 2017 and 18. He reached out to us in 2019, and we ultimately led the Series C in Helium, and basically as part of that pivoted them from not crypto into crypto, which most of the companies that are non-crypto and then pivot to crypto, 99% not good. But we understood the core premise and the challenge, then the opportunity, and it ended up working out. But some of the core insights and opportunities we got from Helium were the importance of risk in these systems. If you're building a wireless network, a wireless network with 10 nodes is not worth 1/1,000,000th of a wireless network with 10 million nodes. A wireless network with 10 nodes is worth 0 because it's so small that you don't have enough threshold scale that any customer will care. And so this is the fundamental chicken and egg problem for all kinds of physical infrastructure networks. Is most people, if you're Hive mapper and you have 10 miles of roads mapped, no one cares. Come back with 10 million miles and now we'll get interested, right? And so the really key thing about Helium is if you're the guy number one who's buying the first hotspot, you are taking on an incredible amount of risk that not enough other people will buy hotspots and deploy hotspots such that eventually it will be a useful network. And so because of that, you should be compensated more in terms of getting more tokens or more equity exposure to the long-term success of the system if you were the first one. And that's really the beauty of these DePIN systems, is every one of them is unique, and you can design the algorithm for handing out tokens in different ways, but you want to make sure that you're giving rewards to the people who show up first. And those people, by definition, if you're the first 100 people buying a Helium hotspot, you care. You're there because you believe in the vision, and you want those people to earn a lot of tokens, and you want them to believe, and you want them to go tell all their friends, and they go talk about it on the internet. And this notion of risk and reward really has like been the most important kind of thing we've come to appreciate about these DePIN networks.
That actually reminds me, you may have mentioned this in another comment, but that I think it was you, that having 1,000 people support review is much less valuable, or having 10,000 support is much less valuable than having 100 core, evangelists. And so what you're talking about a little bit is having core evangelists early stage that believe and then are also rewarded. So they're doubly kind of involved in the protocol.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like a common thing, I see as a VC is, pitch decks. Oh, we have 10,000 people in our Discord or in our community or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but like people who buy a hotspot and put it down, like, okay, there's a cash outlay. They spend some time to set up the hotspot. Like that's substantial more commitment. Even for a virtual infrastructure network like Fluence, they're ever required to like go to the GitHub, read some of the documentation, download it, deploy a Linux server, and run it. Like that's a higher commitment than I'm in the Discord. And so looking for those core community members who care enough to do some amount of work and ideally lay out some cash. It doesn't need to be a huge amount, but like lay out some cash. Those are the people you can depend on.
And so, maybe back up for a second, that you mentioned that community as being a critical part of DePIN, and the definition of DePIN has kind of expanded as everyone is trying to be a DePIN project now. So when you think of DePIN, do you have a particular definition of it, or is it that kind of capital investment that is the kind of core component of it for you?
There's definitely different DePIN models. I described with Helium, the really key thing is about this bootstrap, using tokens to bootstrap a network to achieve threshold scale. And Hive Mapper, like very much is kind of the same thing. Most of the DVINs or the virtual infrastructure networks don't have the same problem to the same degree. If you're scaling like Fluence or IONET or LivePeer, yeah, you need like whatever, 500 GPUs, whatever, some number to get started, but you don't need 5 million to get started. And you can start like getting the service going. So those systems, you want to tune supply and demand to be more close to one another. And Helium, you need to get the supply to 1 million before anyone will care. And so the dynamics because of that are how you think about the token and the early community members. Like those things definitely differ. I think the other kind of interesting vector we've started to think about with DePIN is like, can you use something that feels like DePIN to actually drive behavioral change? And I think the market here that's most relevant would be energy. So like people have been talking about smart grid, like buy and sell from the grid, kind of a thing. There's been like demand response programs for like a while. People have tried to be like, hey, if you opt into our program, and you save $10 a month, we'll give you $5 back. Or there's been these kinds of systems. Well, I think a very interesting theory that has not really been explored yet is, can you give people those rewards back, not in cash, but in tokens, and then have those people like say, I'm going to commit to keep on doing this behavioral change so that I can accrue more like long-term equity in the system. So like that's kind of the newest idea that's like, it's built on the core DePIN theory that I think is pretty interesting. So there's different configurations of it for sure.
When you sort of mentioned tokens and maybe spend a moment on, or longer than a moment on token economics. And I think that, from discussions I've had with DePIN founders, there's a wide range in terms of the token centrality in the network and how it actually, the growth of the network benefits the token or not. I'm kind of curious how you see that in the architectures that you particularly like or models you particularly like or don't.
Yeah, I mean, I generally like revenue to flow back to token holders. There's different ways to do that. You can do burn and mint. You can do work tokens like staking and stuff. I don't want to give a universal answer because I think there's a lot of things that are use case dependent. But the most important thing is you need to have some of the revenue flowing back to token holders. That way, people can get the upside for their capital outlay or their time outlay up front.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And also, what that also does is it gives you a sense as to success would be correlated with scarcity or with token price theoretically as well, which is not a direct link with a lot of projects.
Yeah, that's right.
You sort of talked about this. You sort of implied this a little bit with the network size, but there are certain industries that are dominated by tech giants for whom I think as a venture capitalist, you'd be very reluctant to fund a competitor. And you think of, not going to necessarily fund a competitor, direct competitor to an Amazon or Google in any of their particular verticals, but DePIN, where you actually get the crowdsource world, sets up a system of incentives that makes you actually potentially a network that could compete. And it's kind of curious if you mentioned the Hive Mapper example as one. Are there other examples where you're never going to fund a direct competitor to Google Maps, but maybe the Hive Mapper model, because it involves a community, is actually a way to do that? And then does that correlate to other projects that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're kind of touching on another key part of this, which is risk. And I spoke about risk at the beginning in terms of upside, of like, hey, you're guy number 1, you want more upside than guy number 500. But there's also the element of risk in terms of diversification of risk, which is if you wanted to fund a Google Maps competitor and like you wanted to get a bunch of drivers and cars and equipment and whatever, like that's one person is now having to risk all of that, or like, I would say one person, but like could be multiple VCs, but it's like a handful of small parties who have a lot of cash. Or in the DePIN model, you get a million people to put up a $300 hotspot. It's just like, that's a completely different funding model. And so that's the other great benefit of DePINs is they just naturally diversify risk. And they typically do so in a way that aligns supply with demand in some sense. And that's a really important part of these systems is it just makes it easier to go after these markets that were otherwise unfundable. I mean, no one has funded the build out of a new telecom network like ever. Like all 4 of the major telecoms in the US today are downstream forks off of the original Bell Labs AT&T, which is like Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the fucking telephone. There's like one course of history that gets you to still the 4, I guess 3 now, because T-Mobile and Sprint merged. And so telecom networks are so capital intensive, it's just impossible to make it work. And this is the first time anyone's even like tried, and like it's kind of sort of working, and like that's awesome to see.
It's very interesting. And those are examples of projects that I think certainly have some traction. I guess I know you certainly backed Helium. What are examples, or why are reasons you haven't backed projects? Given the growth of the space, you must have turned down dozens and dozens of projects. Anything that you sort of stands out among those that you haven't liked?
Yeah, I mean, I think an area that we've generally stayed away from has been ones that require active engagement from the user. And what I mean by that is in Helium or Hive Mapper or Fluence, there's a one-time setup, which is like buy the hotspot and plug it in, download the app, takes 5 minutes, whatever. But then you just like the hotspot sits there and you don't have to do anything. Say Hive Mapper, you put the thing in your window, set it up, you're done. Fluence, like set up the server runs, you're done. And I'll contrast that against, like, for example, there's a whole bunch of people doing like data labeling stuff for AI now. There's people who've been doing stuff like flying drone, like drone-based kind of like markets or whatever. And my concern with all of those is every time you want to use the network, a human needs to go do something. And maybe in the DePIN model, you can have your cost be lower than in a centralized model, in that like maybe the guy like lives closer to the park where someone wants to fly the drone or whatever, as opposed to you having your employee who's driving like from 45 minutes across town. So like there's some cost savings there, potentially. But like the guy who's going and flying the drone still is taking the time to go fly the drone. And that guy has a cost of his or her time. And maybe they value themselves at $5 an hour, maybe they value themselves at $50 an hour, maybe they value themselves at $500 an hour. I don't know. But like you have an ongoing marginal cost of human labor. And so like you don't gain that structural benefit in quite the same way. So we generally haven't been doing DePINs that require what we call like active engagement. We like the ones that are passive, where it's a one-time setup and then you just chill.
Interesting. That's that certainly grasp that. And that also gets to supply versus demand and customers. And so you mentioned earlier that Helium had to grow. You have to get the supply to a certain level effectively in order for demand to happen at all. Other areas like you can think of Filecoin and others who have grown supply dramatically, and now the demand is the focus. And I know in our conversations you're very focused on customers. So how do you think about supply demand in the DePIN space and adoption of it in different areas?
Yeah, I mean the good thing about token incentives is it's very easy to build up supply. I would say easy, like I don't have to call it super easy, but like easier than building demand, because like you can there's now a whole cohort of people all over the world in every country who like they know what crypto is, they know what DePIN is, they know what DVIN is, and like they're eager to participate because they're capitalists and they want to make money. And so it's awesome now that like the market has been primed that those people exist and are looking for new opportunities. And if you structure things correctly and make it easy, you get a token in there, like you can get that out there. Demand is harder, and it's hard to generalize demand just because of how heterogeneous it is. But like Helium is selling a mobile cell phone service to consumers, and that's very different go-to-market than HiveMapper. HiveMapper is going to car companies and FedEx and UPS and like selling enterprise mapping systems, whatever, to those guys. So the go-to-market motions are pretty different. I think a big part of our underwriting process is understanding the team's background as it pertains to that market, and us developing confidence that that team can go and tackle that go-to-market. I'll just use HiveMapper as the example here. Ariel, who's the founder there, Ariel has been working on maps his entire professional career. He was working on Yahoo Maps, MapQuest, like OG, and his whole life is maps. And like, I really haven't spent much time thinking about maps in my life, but like this dude, and he knows all the people at Apple and at Google and at Mapbox and like whatever, Niantic and all of these mapping companies like that we don't think of. And like they all know, all these people know each other, and like he knows all of them. And so we were like, okay, we think this guy is going to be able to make the phone calls and like make those deals happen. And I think on chain, HiveMapper is doing like $3 or $4 or $5 million in revenue, something like that. All the data is on chain. They haven't announced who the customers are, but like the revenue is transparent. And so I feel pretty good that like in those markets, you can go get after it. The other I'd say thing I can somewhat generalize is, domain specific knowledge matters in these markets. And the founders we're going to probably put the most behind are going to be the ones where we're like, okay, we know you have that domain specific knowledge.
You mentioned Ariel and spending his career on maps, and when I spoke to him, it sort of felt like he was primed, like this was the obvious only thing that he could ultimately do, but it required the crypto markets to get to a certain level, like decentralized technology to get to a certain level, hardware like video get to a certain level. So what do you think about the confluence of a variety of these technologies all becoming usable in the last 6 to 24 months that actually enabled this whole sector, which wasn't possible even maybe when you started Multicoin?
Yeah, I mean, Helium, for those that don't remember, launched its own blockchain in 2019 because they looked at Ethereum and they're like, Ethereum is not going to work for what we want to do. They built their own blockchain, and that came with an extraordinary number of problems, and was a real hindrance for them. They ended up eventually migrating to Solana, I think a year and a half ago. But yeah, the tech wasn't ready, to your point. Now I think we really do have the requisite pieces in terms of we have blockchain into L2s and Solana and Aptos and Sui and Say and stuff. And we have the capital markets. And we have like the fact that DePIN is now a term, and like it's been incepted into like the consciousness of the crypto market. When we were first investing in Helium, we were terrified that no one was going to buy a hotspot because we were like, who's the idiot? The hotspots were $500 at first. They came down in price later. But we were like, who are the idiots who are going to spend $500 to buy we figured there would be 1,000 people. We weren't really worried about the first 1,000. But like, we were like, who's guy number 14,300 who's going to do this? And like it ended up working, but like there was a real risk it wasn't going to work. And that was our single biggest fear. But now that it has worked, it just gives the builders more confidence to go and build, and it gives all the random people in the world more confidence to like go give it a shot too. And so it's like now that we can all see it, like AI, right? Like pre-ChatGPT, everyone's like, oh yeah, whatever. There's a smart bot that can like answer any question. I didn't believe that, and like now we all believe it, right? And so incepting that belief in the people's minds is probably the most important unlock.
And if they had started that hotspot 4 years earlier, it would have cost $1,000 to build.
Oh yeah,
right?
No, in fact, when we were doing our DD on all the hotspots, Amir was their prior generation of hotspots were like $3,000 or $4,000, and there was some breakthrough with some ARM chip that like they could acquire at a price point, and some software-defined radio thing came off some patent that was like from 18 years prior, and he's like, I can ship this thing for the first time now, and I couldn't ship this 1 year ago. And so yeah, just incredible confluence of events.
Super interesting. And I think that's true across multiple DePIN projects, from even whether XM is now building its, technology that would probably be difficult to have built 5 years ago. So totally grasp that. What do you think, taking that to another level in terms of infrastructure, which you mentioned, we now have infrastructure in terms of, compute and storage, but a lot of, node operators and a lot of crypto projects still use Amazon. Do you think that shifts to be fully, or use, let's say, the cloud? Do you think that shifts off the cloud at some point where it becomes default to be decentralized across the full stack? Does it happen soon? Does it happen? How do you sort of see that kind of L1 to other protocols using decentralized kind of options instead of the cloud?
The transition there will be a general transition away from cloud services towards decentralized ones that will take a long time, 5 to 10 more years. The hardest thing to decentralize is the state of these systems. And like we have asset ledgers now, like Ethereum and Solana and stuff, but like those just handle payments or they handle money movements. But like if you're doing WeatherXM or you're doing Hivemapper, like Hivemapper today, all of the images go to Amazon. And that's where they do all of the post-processing and all that shit. And like they would like to use some decentralized alternatives, but like they're not ready for what they want. And I think the Hivemapper team will decentralize the stack as they can, but the tools just haven't been ready. There's obviously a whole bunch of people in this room and around the world who are doing compute stuff and AI stuff and GPUs and storage, and we've got Ceramic and Tableland and Filecoin and all the, so like all these pieces continue to evolve, to get to that point. But each of those is going to be like its own independent function to get there. The hardest, I think, will be like persistent state at scale, but we'll see. I'm generally more optimistic in unbundling bandwidth and compute use cases than I am state.
Fair enough. Related, another kind of hot area is real world assets. So how do you think about, is there a confluence or a relationship between DePIN and RWAs?
Depends on how you define RWAs, but actually, yeah, there's one example I can think of. We announced an investment a few months ago in a company called Baxis. They're a whiskey marketplace. It's like StockX or GOAT for whiskey. Turns out there wasn't a marketplace for whiskey collecting prior. They're like the first ones who were really going at it. And we asked them, we're like, hey Todd, like, why do you want a token? And he had a bunch of ideas, but the one that is relevant to DePIN that is unintuitive is, for their marketplace to work, they want pricing data on bottles being sold. And obviously with whiskey, there's whiskey bottles everywhere. There's some in stores, there's in H-E-B and Walmart, there's some in a custom liquor store. There's Sotheby's and what's the other auction house? Christie's, and like smaller auction houses, right? Whatever. So like whiskey is transacting in all kinds of places all over the world. And they want transaction data of which bottle is clearing at what price, when and where. And so they have I don't know if it's live yet, but they're planning a mechanism where if you report a price of a whiskey transaction somewhere, they'll give you some tokens because they want to aggregate all of that pricing data. And I was like, it's DePIN-esque, right, in terms of how it works. And I was like, I love that because like then that guy who's reporting the price is now going to almost certainly come look at Baxis next time they're either buying or selling. And so it's a great way to like engender loyalty from those people. You're making the service better. And so that's probably been the coolest intersection of DePIN and RWA I've seen.
Definitely not something I was thinking about.
Not something we thought about either, but it's pretty cool.
And what about we had a panel earlier talking about AI and DePIN, or AI and compute. How do you think about AI entering this space, or how you kind of seeing it overlap with any of the investments either in DePIN or others you're making?
Yeah, I mean the probably the single most crowded DePIN category today would be GPU marketplaces for focused on AI. We're investors in a couple of those, Render and IO. So it's obvious AI's hot. Makes sense to go after it. A lot of questions around it, but I think the one that I'd say I'm most optimistic about is I think that the models will evolve over time. Well, sorry. I think that demand for compute is like far in excess of supply, and I think this will be true because like what AI is doing is we're moving from the traditionally deterministic computing to non-deterministic computing, and non-deterministic computing is just like way more compute power required. And if we're going to apply non-deterministic reasoning to effectively every facet of computation, then that would imply that the entire silicon fab chain was built around deterministic computing and not non-deterministic computing. And so, and the lag time on building fabs is like 5 years and billions of dollars. So my theory is that we'll have a structural shortage of silicon for like at least 5-6 years as all of these use cases ramp up. And if that continues to be the case, then I think the models, instead of everyone saying, okay, can the hardware support the models developers will turn around and say, we know what the hardware constraints are. We're going to tweak the models to fit the hardware. And that I mean, generally people are playing with smaller models, and like, there's the 7 billion models that run on phones and stuff now. But I think there's going to be a whole class of models that are optimized for like consumer grade GPUs, 3080s and 4080s and stuff. And I think that will become a pretty large part of what will power inference workloads for all kinds of applications in a few years.
So does that then give an advantage to the groups, the parties that already have access to these GPUs now? They then have the advantage because they have a larger piece of what is effectively, for some period of time, a semi-fixed pie?
Potentially. I mean, that, I think that the CoreWeaves of the world are in a more tenuous position. I don't know what the distribution is of, just look at NVIDIA production between how many server-side chips they make versus consumer. My guess is the consumer numbers are much larger in terms of quantity of chips. And so I'm generally optimistic that like if we can tap into that, there's a big market there. I think you'll be able to within a few years use your Xbox or your iPhone to also like make money from these systems. I think it's just inevitable that we're going to move in that direction. You
mentioned the crowded space in terms of GPUs. How do you think about, I mean, I think we've talked about this, but talk for a moment about also the growth of non-GPU, serverless as a segment, and the traditional sort of boring CPU market, but that is still pretty big.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental thing of crypto is like we have this open public infrastructure. We think mostly about blockchains in that context, but like we have Filecoin now, and we've got teams like Fluence focused on compute. And the hope is that with something like Fluence, you can just throw a function call in the air and just give it some data input, and you don't care who's going to run the workload. You may want to specify some parameters in terms of trust or something else, but like you just throw a call in the air, and someone will catch it and run with it. And that's always kind of struck me as like should exist. Mark Andreessen kind of like with this startup called Ning, which he did after Netscape, like that's what they were trying to do. And it was kind of like a predecessor to AWS. And so like this idea has been floating around for like 30 years of just like having the magical thing in the sky, and you don't know who it is or where it is, and you just throw up a function call and it executes. And like crypto, I think is able to fulfill that vision, both in terms of payment workflows and in terms of all of the right kind of auth and cryptographic infrastructure and everything. So hopefully teams like Fluence can kind of like unlock that market.
And the security component too, which is super important. A couple questions left here, but one is, if you think back to Web 2, you had early projects like MySpace and Yahoo, which have gone by the wayside, obviously, and been outcompeted. And you have projects that were also day one projects like, almost like an Amazon or an eBay that are with us today and have gathered those economies of scale. If you look at DePIN in particular, or even crypto overall, how do you think about that Gen 1 versus Gen 2 model? Do we have the same analogy where you've got some Gen 1s that survive and some Gen 2s that outcompete in certain areas? How do you think about those kind of mistakes that kind of can be made, and new technology, new advances, new crypto economics can outcompete the Gen 1s?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think if you look at the Web 1 guys who fell by the wayside, Yahoo and AOL, I mean, I think fundamentally their problems were like they just picked the wrong strategies. Yahoo was a media company that like tried to be a tech company, and they just never were able to assemble the right strategy. And I don't even appreciate all the errors AOL made, but it was just like I mean, in some sense, you could say they tried to do too many things and they didn't focus. So my general word of advice to DePIN teams would be focus.
Fair enough. And then for, I guess, people, what would you say for people trying to understand the DePIN space? So for a lot of people here, I think, are understand it well. Some are early in it. Are there resources you'd point to? I know there's things you guys have written about it. What would you steer people to kind of give overviews of the sector to kind of get people more familiar with it?
Yeah, we have probably 5 or 6 pieces on our blog that talk about DePIN. We have some videos from the Multicoin summits in the past as well. They're all online and free. Other funds as well have written good DePIN overviews, so you should check those out. And then probably as like a more neutral resource, I think the Masari guys have probably done the most DePIN coverage. So Masari, just go on Masari and type in DePIN, and there's going to be a ton of stuff there.
Terrific. And then last question. This is sort of the audience pleaser, but how big do you see DePIN getting as a sector? I mean, you can. There's debates with now whether the market caps are 10, 20 billion. I'm not really sure, but given the projects you're invested in, what you see out there, how do you see this sector scaling?
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest DePIN market in absolute spend is telecom. There are actually very few markets in the world larger than telecom. You just assume on average that $20 per person per month times 8 billion people. That's like just an extraordinarily large number. So that's probably the largest one to go after in terms of sheer dollars. I guess the next one would be like energy, consumer energy. Obviously, these markets are very fragmented and tons of local differences between countries, but those are probably the 2 largest in terms of sheer dollar scale. And those obviously are like super, super big.
And so those as subsectors of DePIN, we're talking about, hundreds of billions of dollars, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And there is an energy DePIN panel coming up also for you guys to know in 2 panels from now.
All right. Well, let's tune in.
But I think we've reached time, unfortunately. So I want to give a big round of applause to Kyle. Thank you for joining.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.